There is a particular kind of television show, and they do not come along very often, where the drama happening off the screen is genuinely as interesting as anything that ended up on it. Most shows have the occasional bit of behind-the-scenes chaos. A difficult actor, a budget argument, a writer's room that stopped getting along. That is all fairly standard stuff. It comes with the territory. And then there is The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead is a show that managed, across 11 seasons and roughly 14 years of production, to fire its creator, fight its network in court for nearly a decade, lose a stuntman on set, cycle through 4 different showrunners, spark a national debate about race and representation, divide its own fan base so completely on at least half a dozen separate occasions that some of those divisions have never really healed, and still somehow produce spin-offs that people are watching right now. As I'm putting this together, there are active Walking Dead projects on AMC. The show has been off the air in its flagship form since 2022, and the universe it built is still going. That is an extraordinary thing to be true about any television program. It is a genuinely strange thing to be true about one with this much documented turbulence behind the scenes. So that's what this video is. It's a walk through all of it, the controversies, the lawsuits, the decisions that made fans furious, the ones that made critics furious, and the ones that made the people who actually made the show furious. Roughly 15 different moments or eras, covered at a comfortable pace in no particular rush. If you're winding down for the evening, or if you're the kind of person who just likes having something interesting to listen to in the background, that's exactly what this is for. Before we get into any of it, if you're enjoying this channel and you haven't already subscribed, it would genuinely mean a lot. It's completely free. It takes about 2 seconds, and it helps this channel more than you might think. Right, let's get into it. One of the things that makes The Walking Dead an interesting show to revisit in retrospect is that it did not fail quietly. Most television shows that decline do so without much drama. Ratings fade, the audience drifts away, and the show ends either by cancellation or by a finale that relatively few people watch. The Walking Dead's decline was documented in real time, argued about constantly, and accompanied by a kind of ongoing critical inquest that was itself a measure of how much people had invested in the show at its peak. You only get that much sustained argument about a show's failures if the show mattered enough to generate genuine disappointment. The controversies in this video are a record of that disappointment in its various forms: financial, creative, ethical, personal. Some of them involve decisions the show made about its story. Some involve decisions the people running the show made about the people working on it. Some involve decisions the network made about the people making the show. All of them are connected in ways that become clearer when you look at them together rather than separately. I have done my best to be fair to everyone involved. That is harder than it sounds, because The Walking Dead's history involves a lot of situations where multiple people have legitimate grievances, and where the full picture is genuinely complicated. I will try to note when something is disputed. I will also try to say clearly when I think something went wrong, because I think it is useful to be honest about that, even in a video that is primarily trying to be informative rather than argumentative. Right, into it properly now. The Walking Dead premiered on Halloween night 2010. It drew 5.35 million viewers, which for a cable network that at that point most people associated with old films and reruns was a genuinely shocking number. By the end of that first season's 6 episodes, it was clear that AMC had something on their hands that they had not entirely prepared for. And almost immediately, rather than celebrating, the network decided to make the show cheaper. I find this genuinely fascinating as a piece of television history, because the decisions made in those first few months after the show's success shaped essentially everything that followed. The financial arguments that began in late 2010 and early 2011, the ones Frank Darabont and AMC were having behind closed doors, while the public was still talking about how brilliant the show was. Those arguments created the conditions for the firing, the lawsuits, the safety culture, and several of the creative compromises that would eventually cost the show its audience. All of it has roots here. Here is what AMC came to Darabont and the production with after season 1. They wanted to cut the per-episode budget from $3.4 million to somewhere between $2.75 and $3 million. The exact figure varies depending on which account you read, but the range is consistent. They wanted to double the episode order, from 6 episodes to 13. They wanted to take the 30% per episode tax credit the production was receiving from the state of Georgia, a credit the state offered specifically to attract film and television productions, and pocket it themselves rather than letting it offset production costs. There is something almost impressively brazen about that last point. The Georgia tax credit existed to make filming in Georgia more financially viable. AMC had chosen Georgia specifically because of it. And then when the show became successful enough that they wanted to expand it, they decided the credit should go to their bottom line rather than back into the show. Depending on how you calculate it, the combined effect of the budget cut and the credit appropriation represented somewhere in the range of a 20 to 25% reduction in what the production actually had to work with. On top of that, AMC suggested that half of each episode's shooting schedule should take place indoors to save on location costs, which, for a show set in the apocalyptic American South, is a fairly significant creative constraint, and that walkers should be heard but not seen more frequently to save on makeup costs. Heard but not seen walkers on The Walking Dead, a show literally named after the dead who walk. Darabont's response to these demands was, by all available accounts, not measured. He sent an email to executive producer Gail Ann Hurd in this period, describing himself as being in a state of boiling rage and warning that if things did not change, he would start throwing bodies out the door. The email is, by the standards of professional correspondence, quite something. It is also probably the most honest documentation we have of what it felt like to be on that side of the negotiating table in the early days of the show's production. What I think is worth sitting with here is that the show had just had one of the most successful cable debuts in years, and the network's first instinct was not give these people more resources, but how do we make this cheaper? That instinct, the drive to extract maximum return from minimum investment, ran through The Walking Dead's production for its entire run, and almost everyone who worked on the show at a significant creative level eventually came into conflict with it. Frank Darabont was just the first. There is also a practical creative dimension to these budget cuts that rarely gets acknowledged. The Season 2 story decision to spend the majority of 13 episodes on Herschel Green's farm, a choice that became one of the show's most criticised creative moves, was not purely a writer's room preference. The farm was, in significant part, a function of what the show could afford. When you cannot bring in the walkers, and when half your shooting has to be indoors or in limited locations, a farm in rural Georgia becomes very convenient. The pacing problems of Season 2 and the financial decisions made in late 2010 are directly connected in ways that the creative team never really got credit for explaining. But the farm is its own story, and we'll get to it. The budget fight is where everything else begins. The Georgia filming situation is worth pausing on for a moment because it has a slightly stranger texture than it first appears. When AMC chose to film The Walking Dead in Georgia rather than in California or New York, where most major American television productions were historically based, the decision was driven largely by the state's generous film tax incentive program. Georgia offers productions a 30% credit on qualified expenditures, which for a show spending several $million per episode represents meaningful money. The logic AMC had applied was economically rational. Film in Georgia, collect the credit, reduce the effective cost of production. The decision also had creative implications, since the Georgia landscape, its forests, its country roads, its rural towns and quiet suburbs, is genuinely well suited to the visual world Robert Kirkman's comics had established. There is a version of this story where AMC chose Georgia because it was the right place for the show, and the tax credit was a fortunate bonus. What becomes more complicated is the second decision, to take the credit rather than apply it back to the production budget. The tax incentive is structured to benefit the production. When AMC absorbed it into general corporate revenue, they were effectively using the Georgia state government's subsidy to fund their own margins rather than the television show that had attracted the subsidy in the first place. This is not illegal, but it has a quality that creative professionals on the receiving end found difficult to accept. Darabont was not the only person who found this infuriating. The 5 producers who later filed their own lawsuit, including Kirkman, Hurd and Mazzara, were all to varying degrees operating in an environment shaped by these budget decisions. The financial culture that AMC established in 2010 and 2011 did not change when Darabont left. It persisted through every subsequent era of the show's production, creating the conditions for the safety failures that would emerge in 2017. The revolving door of showrunners unable to operate within the constraints they were given, and the eventual legal reckoning. It is also worth noting that AMC's financial position during this period was not one of desperation. The network was profitable. Breaking Bad was in production at the same time, and would eventually become one of the most critically acclaimed television dramas ever made. The Walking Dead was generating unprecedented cable viewership numbers. AMC was, by any standard measure, doing well. The budget pressures on The Walking Dead were not an emergency response to financial crisis. They were a choice about how much of the show's success to reinvest in the show itself. This context matters because it reframes the budget controversy from network in trouble makes difficult decisions to successful company decides maximum extraction is the appropriate response to having a hit. Those are not the same thing, and the distinction colours everything that follows. The Season 1 writing room situation is another dimension of the budget controversy that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Darabont had assembled a writer's room for the show's first season, as showrunners do. After the first season's success, AMC wanted to cut costs on Season 2, and one of the cost-cutting measures proposed was to significantly reduce the size of the writer's room, or in some accounts that circulated at the time, to eliminate it in favour of a single head writer producing outlines that other writers would execute. This was industry-standard practice for some cable dramas, but was considered by many television writers to be a step backward for a show of The Walking Dead's ambition. This specific dispute contributed to the tensions that preceded Darabont's firing and helps explain why several members of the Season 1 writing staff did not continue into Season 2. The Walking Dead that existed after Darabont's departure was, in terms of its creative infrastructure, a somewhat different production from the one he had built, not just because the showrunner changed, but because some of the people who had been part of establishing the show's voice did not return. Frank Darabont directed The Shawshank Redemption in 1994. He directed The Green Mile in 1999. These are not footnotes on a CV, they're two of the most beloved films of the 20th century. The kind of films that show up on those lists of films everyone should see before they die, with enough regularity that you stop noticing them. The man had a particular gift for adapting Stephen King material into something that felt genuinely human, and The Walking Dead, also based on a comic series rather than original screenplay, drew on exactly that sensibility. He had spent 5 years trying to get the show made, 5 years of pitching it to networks who were not sure a zombie drama had a place on television, of refining the concept, of building the creative framework that eventually convinced AMC to give him a 6-episode order. By the time the cameras rolled in Georgia, Darabont had more invested in The Walking Dead than virtually anyone else involved. On July 11th, 2011, he stood on stage at San Diego Comic-Con alongside the cast and producers of the show, promoting the upcoming second season. By all accounts, it was a normal panel. Enthusiastic crowd, excited creative team. The kind of event that feels like a celebration. 3 days later, he was fired. AMC's stated reason was erratic and unprofessional behaviour. Specifically, a failure to conduct what are called director-tone meetings. The sessions in which a showrunner sits with each episode's director before production begins to align on tone and vision. Darabont disputed this characterization entirely. His position was that the tone meetings had been conducted and that the real reason for the firing was the financial dispute that had been running since late 2010. Glenn Mazzara, one of the writers who had survived the first season's writer's room, was named as the new showrunner within 24 hours. The speed of that transition is worth noting. Replacing a showrunner mid-production on a hit television series is not a small thing. It requires months of groundwork, understanding the existing storylines, the character arcs in progress, the creative commitments already made. The fact that Mazzara was ready to step in within a day suggests that whatever happened between AMC and Darabont, AMC had been thinking about this possibility for some time. In late 2013, Darabont and his agency, the Creative Artists Agency, which had a profit participation stake in the show as the packaging agency, filed suit against AMC. The argument at the heart of the lawsuit was specific and technical, but its implications were significant. Darabont's contract entitled him to 15% of the show's profits. The lawsuit alleged that AMC, operating as both the production studio and the broadcasting network, a structure called vertical integration, had set the license fee it charged itself at an artificially low level. Because profit is calculated after the license fee is subtracted from revenue, setting that fee low reduces the apparent profit, which in turn reduces what participants like Darabont are owed. In other words, AMC was allegedly making The Walking Dead look less profitable than it was by controlling both sides of its own financial ledger. This was not an entirely new allegation in Hollywood. Disputes about Hollywood accounting, the various mechanisms by which studios have historically made profitable productions appear unprofitable on paper, have a long history. But The Walking Dead case was notable because the show was so visibly, obviously, publicly successful that the claim it was generating minimal profit was difficult to maintain with a straight face. This was, at various points during the lawsuit's life, the most watched scripted cable drama in the history of American television. Suggesting it had limited profits was, to put it diplomatically, a position requiring some creativity. The case went through the courts for nearly a decade. The trial was scheduled to begin in April 2022. On July 16, 2021, AMC filed paperwork with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the financial regulatory body that requires publicly traded companies to disclose significant events, announcing a settlement. The settlement amount was $200 million. It also included ongoing revenue sharing for Darabont and CAA from future streaming exhibitions of the flagship show and Fear the Walking Dead. The $200 million payment was significant enough that AMC disclosed it would essentially wipe out the company's projected free cash flow for the entire year of 2021. This is a very specific kind of number to settle on, large enough to constitute a meaningful acknowledgement that something had gone wrong, small enough to not quite confirm everything Darabont had claimed. Mazzara, for his part, did acknowledge publicly that Darabont had been treated unfairly during his time on the show. That confirmation, from someone who was there and who had nothing obvious to gain from saying it, is about as close to an independent corroboration as this story ever received. Darabont has not been involved with The Walking Dead in any capacity since 2011. He has directed films and television since. He had a credit on episodes of Mob City, among other things, but nothing that has reached the cultural scale of those first 6 episodes of Walking Dead, the show he spent 5 years trying to get made, and which he left in the middle of its 2nd season, went on to become one of the most watched cable dramas in history, and then generated a universe of spin-offs worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know what the right way to feel about that is. It seems like the kind of situation where almost everyone involved has a legitimate grievance, and the legal settlement is the closest thing to resolution that anyone is going to get. The emails between Darabont and AMC that surfaced as part of the litigation record are worth dwelling on briefly, not because they reveal anything that was not already known about the situation, but because they have a particular quality, the quality of a very talented person who knows they are being treated badly and cannot quite believe it is happening. The boiling rage email to Gail Ann Hurd is the most often cited. There are others. They trace the arc of someone moving from frustration to disbelief to a kind of exhausted anger that stops short of resignation only because resignation would mean accepting that the situation is what it clearly is. Darabont has said in interviews that his experience with the show was one of the more painful of his professional life. This is a person who spent 5 years building something, who convinced actors and writers and crews to invest in it, who wrote and directed the pilot himself, and who was then removed from it before it had finished becoming what he had imagined it becoming. The legal settlement resolves the financial dispute. It does not resolve the other thing. Glenn Mazzara's tenure as showrunner is in some ways the most underappreciated chapter of the Walking Dead story. He inherited a production that was in active turmoil. The writer's room had been disrupted by Darabont's firing, the crew was unsettled, and the creative direction for Season 2 was partially in place and partially not. He stabilised the show. He delivered Season 3, which by the available metrics is among the most successful seasons the show ever produced, and then he departed quietly after creative disagreements with AMC about Season 4's direction. Mazzara confirmed publicly that Darabont had been treated unfairly during his tenure. That confirmation from someone with direct access to the internal dynamics of the production is not a small thing. It means the dispute was not simply a case of a difficult creator clashing with a reasonable network. It means the network's treatment of its most important creative figure was, according to someone in a position to know, genuinely problematic. The settlement is sometimes discussed as though it closes the Darabont chapter of the Walking Dead story. In a legal sense it does. In a creative and human sense, it is harder to say. The show that Darabont imagined and that he spent 5 years working to create was never fully made. What exists, those first 6 episodes, the fragments of Season 2 that bear his sensibility, is genuinely excellent, but it is not the full thing. The budget cuts and the firing arrived before the full thing could exist. That, rather than the settlement amount, is probably the more lasting consequence. There is a particular challenge with running a long-form television drama that does not get discussed as often as it should. A showrunner is not just the person who manages the writer's room. They are the person who decides what the show is, what it values, what questions it is asking, which characters it treats as central, what kind of storytelling it believes in. When you change that person, you change all of those things. Not immediately and not completely, but the shift is real, and audiences can feel it even when they cannot name it. The Walking Dead changed its showrunner 4 times across 11 seasons. Frank Darabont ran the show for Season 1 and roughly half of Season 2 before being fired in July 2011. Glenn Mazzara inherited the production mid-stride, stabilised it, and oversaw Season 3, which broke cable viewership records and more than doubled the audience from the first season premiere. He and AMC issued a joint statement in December 2012 announcing that he would not be continuing past Season 3. The statement was the kind of carefully worded release that communicates creative disagreement without naming it. Mazzara had reportedly wanted to take the show in a direction that AMC did not endorse. Scott Gimple took over for Season 4 and ran the show through Season 8, the longest tenure of any Walking Dead showrunner. He was there for the peak ratings of Season 5, for the Negan storyline, for the dumpster incident, for the Season 7 premiere, and for Carl's death. He was promoted to Chief Content Officer of the Walking Dead franchise at the end of Season 8, handing the showrunner role to Angela Kang. Angela Kang ran Seasons 9 through 11, the final 3, and is widely credited with stabilising the creative voice of the show after the turbulence of the Gimple era. Critics generally responded to her seasons more positively. The audience by that point had already contracted significantly. What this means in practice is something worth thinking about. The Walking Dead had 4 distinct creative architectures over its run. Darabont's version, atmospheric, patient, character-driven, rooted in the aesthetic sensibility he had developed through his film work, barely existed. You can see it in those first 6 episodes and in the fragments of Season 2 that he shaped before his departure, but it never got to fully become what it was trying to be. Mazzara's version was faster paced, more plot-driven, more willing to move characters and storylines forward with momentum. Season 3, The Prison, The Governor, Woodbury, reflects his instincts. It is a genuinely good season of television, and it is noticeably different in rhythm from what came before and after. Gimple's version is the most complicated to assess because it covers the widest range of quality. At its best, the early run of Season 4, the back half of Season 5, it is the show operating with real confidence. At its worst, the Season 7 premiere, Carl's death, the later Negan storyline, it is the show making decisions that its own lead actor would later publicly describe as going too far. Kang's version arrived after the structural damage had already been done. She produced television that was, by general critical consensus, competent and sometimes excellent, but she was working to rebuild something rather than build something new, and the audience numbers reflected a trust deficit that good storytelling alone could not fully repair. No other show of comparable size and cultural weight cycled through 4 distinct creative visions across 11 seasons and continued to function. That The Walking Dead did is remarkable. That it bears the marks of all 4 visions, sometimes in the same season, occasionally in the same episode, is one of the more interesting things about its structural texture. When fans disagree about what The Walking Dead is, they are often actually disagreeing about which era's Walking Dead they are describing. And they are all correct, because they are each describing a different show that happened to share the same cast and setting. This is something I find genuinely interesting about the show's long-term reputation, that people can argue about it at complete cross purposes, and neither side is technically wrong. Someone who loves The Walking Dead and means Season 4 is having a completely different conversation from someone who loves it and means Season 2. They just haven't realised it yet. The most consistent influence across all 4 eras is the one that never officially ran the show at all. Robert Kirkman, the comic creator who maintained an executive producer credit throughout and whose source material provided the scaffolding for the first several seasons. Even Kirkman, as we will get to later, eventually ended up in a legal dispute with the network. That is how complete the pattern is. There is a specific kind of institutional knowledge that television showrunners carry that cannot be transferred through documents or story bibles. It is the knowledge of why a particular choice was made, not the choice itself, which can be documented, but the reasoning behind it, the argument that was had in the writer's room, the alternative that was considered and rejected, and the feeling that made one option seem right at the time. When a showrunner leaves, that knowledge leaves with them. The Walking Dead changed showrunners 4 times. That means it lost that institutional knowledge 4 times. The show's story bible, the accumulated record of decisions made and directions chosen, would have been handed over at each transition, but the person who could have explained why Darabont chose a particular narrative, beat in Season 1, was not available to Mazzara in Season 2. The person who could have explained Mazzara's thinking about the Governor's arc in Season 3 was not available to Gimple in Season 4. This creates what might be called narrative drift. the gradual movement of a story away from its original centre, not because any individual decision was wrong, but because no single person was maintaining the thread across all of them. Characters whose arcs were building towards something in Darabont's vision arrived at a Mazzara-era conclusion that may not have been the one they were heading toward. Stories that Mazzara set in motion were resolved by Gimple, who had different instincts about what they meant. Andrea is often cited as the most visible casualty of this phenomenon. In the comics, Andrea is one of the most important characters, a survivor who becomes one of Rick's most capable allies and whose relationship with him across hundreds of issues is one of the comic's central emotional threads. In the television series, Andrea's arc seemed at various points to be building towards something substantial and then consistently arrived somewhere smaller. She was killed at the end of Season 3 in a manner that many fans and critics felt was disproportionate to the investment the show had seemed to be making in her. Whether Andrea's television fate was the product of creative choice, of showrunner transitions, or of some combination of the two is not something anyone has confirmed definitively. What is clear is that the character existed across 3 different creative regimes. The first season under Darabont, the second under a transitional period, the third under Mazzara, and never accumulated the coherence that her comic counterpart carried. The institutional drift that 4 showrunner changes produce is visible in her arc in a way that is difficult to attribute to any single decision. Angela Kang's arrival in Season 9 stabilised more than the writing. It stabilised the sense that someone was in charge and knew what they wanted the show to be. The reviews for her seasons are notably warmer than those for the later Gimple era, but she was also working with an audience that had been through 5 seasons of accumulating trust damage, and her job was fundamentally different from Darabont's original one. He was building something. She was repairing it. Those are very different kinds of work. There is one more dimension of the showrunner situation that deserves acknowledgement. The decision to promote Scott Gimple to Chief Content Officer of the Walking Dead franchise at the end of Season 8, rather than simply replacing him as showrunner, created an interesting structural situation. Gimple's promotion meant that he remained the senior creative authority over the franchise, even as Angela Kang took over day-to-day creative control of the flagship show. This layered authority structure, a new showrunner operating within a franchise framework maintained by her predecessor, is not unique to Walking Dead, but it added a level of complexity to the creative environment of the final 3 seasons. Kang has spoken diplomatically about this dynamic in interviews, which is to say she has not spoken about it with much specificity. The arrangement worked well enough that the final seasons received the most consistent critical praise the show had earned in years. Whether it created any friction that shaped specific creative decisions is not something the available public record answers clearly. Season 2 of The Walking Dead is probably the most argued about season of the show's entire run. It is also, in a strange way, one of the most important ones, not necessarily because it is the best, but because of what it reveals about the specific pressures the show was operating under and what it managed to do despite them. The season consists of 13 episodes, most of which take place on a single farm belonging to a veterinarian named Herschel Green. The central dramatic mystery for much of those 13 episodes is the whereabouts of a young girl named Sophia, who went missing in the season premiere. The survivors search for her. Episodes pass, they search some more. The phrase "Where's Sophia" became, in fan discourse and in critical writing about the show, a shorthand for a particular kind of television storytelling problem, the kind where a narrative question is extended past the point at which it can generate meaningful tension, and where the audience's patience begins to read as exploitation rather than investment. I think this criticism is fair, and I also think it misses something. Let me explain what I mean. The creative context for Season 2's pacing is inseparable from the financial decisions made after season 1. AMC had wanted more episodes, 13 rather than 6, and had wanted them cheaper. That meant the production could not bring the scale that had defined the season 1 finale. It could not afford the kinds of large-scale walker sequences that had made the pilot and the early episodes so visually striking. And it meant that a significant portion of the season needed to take place in contained, controlled locations that did not require extensive location costs. Herschel's farm is a financially convenient piece of geography. It is a single-owned location, largely static, requiring relatively few walkers and relatively modest set construction. The budget pressures that Frank Darabont had been raging about in his emails forced the show to find a story that could be told in a limited space. Now, having said that, the farm season is also where the show discovered something about itself that it would never fully let go of. The conversations that happen on that farm, between Rick and Shane about the nature of survival, between Herschel and the group about what kind of people they're going to be, between Glenn and Maggie in the early stages of what becomes one of the show's most enduring relationships. Those conversations are where The Walking Dead stopped being a horror show that happened to have characters in it and started being a show about what people become when everything is stripped away. The barn scene, when it finally arrives, after episodes of searching and arguing and losing hope, is one of the most genuinely devastating sequences the show ever produced. If you know what I'm talking about, you know. Sophia walking out of that barn, already turned, and Rick being the one who has to end it. The camera on the group's faces, the silence before the shot. It is the kind of moment that the entire preceding build-up exists to make possible, and it lands with a weight that would not have existed if the show had not made you wait. So the farm season is not quite the failure its reputation suggests. It is a season shaped by constraint that found within that constraint something the show needed. It is also genuinely slow in places, and the critical memory of it is understandable. Both things are true. What the farm season cost the show was a certain kind of momentum. The Walking Dead began season 1 as something that felt urgent and propulsive. Season 2 slowed that down to a pace that some viewers never entirely forgave. And because the slow pace was a product of budget decisions rather than purely creative ones, Darabont and the writers' room never got to make the argument they might have made, that the slowness was intentional, was purposeful, was part of what the show was trying to do. By the time that argument could have been made, Darabont was already gone. The critical reception to season 2 changed significantly over time, in a way that is interesting to track. In 2011 and 2012, when the season was airing, the critical consensus was broadly negative on the pacing. The complaints about the farm were frequent and pointed. By the mid-2000s, as the show had moved into its peak ratings period and then begun its decline, retrospective assessments of season 2 became notably warmer. Critics and fans who had been frustrated by the pacing came to appreciate the character work that the slow season had made possible. This is a pattern that appears in assessments of other slow-burn television seasons, The Sopranos' 5th season, certain runs of Mad Men, where the immediate critical reception undervalued what was happening at the character level because the plot-level momentum was insufficient to satisfy week-to-week viewing. Herschel's farm season is probably a case where the show's reputation caught up to what the season was actually doing. Scott Wilson's performance as Herschel Green is one of the things that saves the farm season from its own pacing problems. Wilson, who died in 2018, brought to Herschel a quality that the show badly needed during this period: moral weight without moral certainty. Herschel's position at the start of season 2, keeping walkers in his barn because he believes they can be cured, because among them are members of his own family, is simultaneously defensible and untenable, and Wilson found both qualities simultaneously. The argument between Rick and Herschel about the nature of the dead is one of the show's most genuinely philosophical exchanges, and it was available only because the farm season had the time to develop it. The Season 2 mid-season finale, Pretty Much Dead Already, the episode in which the barn is opened and Sophia is found, remains one of the most watched and most discussed episodes of the show's first 2 seasons. The emotional delivery of that ending required everything that came before it. The frustration of "Where's Sophia?" is not separate from the devastation of the barn. It is the prerequisite for it. There is a lesson in this that the show's later seasons did not always remember. Narrative patience, even when it tests the audience's willingness to wait, can produce moments that instantaneous plot movement cannot. The farm's problems were real, but the moments it made possible were also real, and some of them rank among the finest things the show ever produced. Steven Yeun had been on The Walking Dead since the pilot. Glenn Rhee was, in the show's early seasons, the character the audience trusted most completely. Quick, resourceful, fundamentally decent, in a world that kept asking whether decency was sustainable. He was the person you wanted to have around. So when Season 6, Episode 3, Thank You, appeared to kill him, the response was not just surprise, it was the particular kind of grief that comes from losing someone you had decided was safe. October 2015. The episode ends with an aerial shot of bodies being torn apart beside a dumpster in a city alleyway. Glenn is in there somewhere. The camera does not confirm that he is dead. The show does not confirm it either. And then it keeps not confirming it for 4 full episodes. The internet responded more or less immediately and with considerable energy. The Walking Dead had killed a lot of major characters by this point. It had killed Laurie, it had killed Andrea, it had killed Herschel. The deaths were painful, but the show had established that this was what it did. Major characters died, sometimes without warning. That was part of the deal, but something about this one felt different. And the reason it felt different is that the show never actually confirmed Glenn was dead. The aerial shot was deliberately ambiguous. The guts being devoured could have been Nicholas. Glenn could theoretically have survived. The show kept that door open, and it kept it open for 4 full episodes, nearly a month of broadcast time, without resolving it. During those 4 episodes, the Walking Dead production team went further. Steven Yeun's name was removed from the opening credits. His name did not appear in the In Memoriam segment that the companion program, The Talking Dead, ran for fallen characters. The show was, actively, trying to maintain the impression that Glenn might be dead without confirming it, which meant they were also deliberately reinforcing the impression without actually committing to it. When Episode 7, Heads Up, finally resolved the situation by showing that Glenn had crawled under the dumpster while Nicholas was devoured above him and had waited for the walkers to disperse, the fandom had a name for it almost immediately: Dumpstergate. The anger was specific and somewhat layered, which I think is what made it last. It was not simply that people were annoyed the show had faked to death. It was that the fake had been sustained for a month, had involved deliberate production decisions to mislead the audience, and then resolved in a way that required a fairly generous interpretation of the show's internal physics. The idea that Glenn could be lying beneath a dumpster, partially underneath a disemboweled corpse, while walkers devoured the body directly above him without getting bitten, walkers who infect through broken skin, was the kind of thing that worked if you really wanted it to work, and did not quite hold up if you looked at it directly. Chandler Riggs, who played Carl, said at a convention panel that even the cast had no idea it was a fake-out. He described reading the script for Thank You and seeing the line, "Glenn is being torn apart," with no indication that this was anything other than what it appeared to be. He said his reaction was, "Not yet. We're not there yet," knowing from the comics that Glenn's actual death involved Negan and a baseball bat. The cast was as surprised as the audience. The decision to keep it vague was not shared widely within the production. Showrunner Scott Gimple defended the choice in a Hollywood Reporter interview, comparing Glenn's survival under the dumpster to earlier moments of improbable survival in the show. Tyrese fighting through a massive walker herd in Season 4, for example. His argument was that extraordinary physical outcomes were part of the show's established language. Most critics found this unconvincing, and honestly, so do I. There is a difference between a character surviving against the odds within a tense scene, something the audience is watching in real time, and a show spending 4 weeks maintaining the deliberate impression that a beloved character is dead when it already knows he is not. One is storytelling, the other is audience management. The line between them is not always clear, but this particular instance was about as unambiguous as these things get. The significance of Dumpstergate is not the moment itself, really. It is what the moment established about the relationship between the show and its audience. From that point forward, a meaningful portion of the viewership was watching The Walking Dead with a new kind of awareness. The awareness that the show was willing to use their emotional investment as a mechanism for generating attention, and that deaths might or might not be real. That awareness is a kind of defensive detachment, and once it sets in, it changes the texture of everything that follows. The specific mechanics of how the show managed the Dumpstergate period deserve a bit more attention, because they were unusually deliberate. Removing Steven Yeun's name from the opening credits for 4 episodes is not a casual decision. Credit sequences are governed by union rules and contractual obligations, and changing them requires active effort and negotiation. Someone at the production level chose to pursue that change, specifically to maintain the ambiguity around Glenn's fate. The Talking Dead, the companion program that aired immediately after each Walking Dead episode and was hosted by Chris Hardwick, ran a segment called In Memoriam that acknowledged characters who had died in that week's episode. During the 4-episode period between Glenn's apparent death and his confirmed survival, his name did not appear in Memoriam. This was another deliberate choice, a production decision not to include him in the dead list, even though the episode had presented his death as the most plausible reading of events. These details matter because they reveal the extent to which the Dumpstergate deception was coordinated across multiple channels simultaneously. It was not just the episode itself that maintained the ambiguity. It was the companion program, the credit sequence, the social media response from cast members who had been briefed on what to say. The audience was being managed, carefully and across multiple platforms, in a way that required significant production-level coordination. The fan community's response to this coordination was itself interesting. A subset of Walking Dead fans, largely those who read the comics and understood how Glenn's death was supposed to happen, identified the dumpster scenario as a fake-out almost immediately. They argued in forums and comment sections that the show would not waste Glenn's actual death on a dumpster scene with Nicholas when the comics had reserved him for Negan. This prediction turned out to be correct, but predicting it correctly did not soften the frustration of having been misled for a month. There is also a dimension of the Dumpstergate controversy that connects to the show's racial dynamics, though it was not always articulated this way in the original discourse. Glenn was the show's most prominent Asian American character. The fake-out placed him in a situation of apparent death that was sustained and managed across multiple weeks in a way that accumulated emotional weight on the audience. When his actual death arrived in Season 7, under circumstances that generated their own controversy, the dumpster fake-out was retroactively understood by some critics as having been a kind of rehearsal for what the show was eventually going to do to Glenn. That it had practiced misleading the audience about his survival in preparation for the moment when his death would be real. Whether that reading is fair to the intentions of the people who made the choice is debatable. But it is the reading that some people brought to Season 7, and it shaped how the eventual death was experienced. Steven Yeun's public response to the dumpster controversy was notably measured. He did not directly criticize the creative decision in the immediate aftermath, which was diplomatically appropriate given his continued employment on the show. In subsequent interviews, after Glenn's actual death in the Season 7 premiere, he spoke more openly about what the character had meant to him and about the experience of playing someone who had become genuinely important to the show's audience over 7 years. Yoon had been with The Walking Dead since its first episode. Glenn Rhee was, in many respects, the show's conscience, the character who most consistently articulated what the survivors were supposed to be protecting in each other. His journey from resourceful outsider to family man, from the pizza delivery guy in the pilot to the expectant father kneeling in that field, was one of the show's most complete human arcs. Yoon's performance across those 7 seasons is independent of the controversies surrounding the character's specific story decisions, genuinely excellent television work. He has gone on, since Walking Dead, to have one of the most substantial and interesting careers of anyone who appeared in the show. Minari, Nope, Beef, work that suggests the full extent of his abilities was not entirely captured by the Glenn Rhee role. But the Glenn role made his name, and the dumpster incident and its aftermath are part of the record of how that name was built and what it cost to build it. The thing about the Season 6 finale is that the first 80% of it is genuinely good. I want to say that before getting into why the last 5 minutes generated the response they did, because this often gets lost in the retelling. Last Day on Earth, Season 6 finale, April 2016, 90 minutes, builds its tension through accumulation. Rick's group is trying to get Maggie to medical care, and every road they take has been sealed off by the Saviours. Each blockade is larger than the last. Each time the group thinks they have found a way through, they find they have not. It is sustained, creeping dread done well, and it communicates something real about the nature of Negan's operation. This is not a ragtag group of violent survivors. This is an organisation that has been thinking 3 moves ahead. And then Negan arrives. Jeffrey Dean Morgan steps out of an RV, and the performance is exactly what the character required. The monologue he delivers, the eeny, meeny, mini-mo sequence, the slow walk along the kneeling line of survivors, it is, as a piece of villain introduction, quite effective. And then Negan swings. The camera moves to a first-person perspective, the point of view of whoever is about to be hit. Blood streaks the lens. The screen goes dark, credits. The audience would not find out who had been killed until the Season 7 premiere, scheduled for October 2016. 6 months later. The backlash was immediate. The primary criticism was not that a cliffhanger had been used. The show had ended on cliffhangers before, but that this specific cliffhanger had a quality of deliberate withholding that felt qualitatively different from narrative suspense. The entire season had been constructed as a delivery mechanism for this moment. Negan's introduction, the bat, the death of a major character. The audience had invested in all of that build-up, had accepted the escalating tension across 20-odd episodes of Saviour's storyline, had waited for the payoff. And the payoff was, you have to wait 6 more months. Gimple told the press that the wait would be worth it. That statement was widely reported and would become one of the more recalled pieces of Walking Dead promotional commentary, particularly after the Season 7 premiere generated its own controversy. The ratings data from this period is interesting. The Season 6 finale drew 14.1 million viewers, a strong number, though down from the peak of 17.29 million achieved the previous October. The Season 7 premiere, driven entirely by the need to know who had been killed, drew 17 million viewers. That spike, from 14 million to 17 million, is a measure of how effectively the cliffhanger had generated curiosity. The episodes that followed told a different story. By the end of Season 7, the finale was drawing 11 million. That is a 35% drop within a single season. The curiosity that the cliffhanger had generated was real and measurable. What the cliffhanger had cost, be an audience trust in the feeling of being respected rather than manipulated, was also real and also measurable. There is a version of events in which the Negan cliffhanger is looked back on as the moment The Walking Dead's relationship with its own audience changed in a way it never fully recovered from. The dumpster incident had introduced a question. The cliffhanger answered it. Yes, this show will use your emotional investment as a commercial mechanism, and once that is understood, something shifts. I think this reading is essentially correct, though it has always struck me as slightly sad. Not because I am particularly sympathetic to the network, but because the actual introduction of Negan, if it had been allowed to land in the season 6 finale rather than deferred, would probably have been one of the best moments in the show's entire run. The setup was that good. The sacrifice of it for 6 months of anticipation was, in retrospect, a genuinely bad trade. The narrative mechanics of the season 6 finale deserve a bit of analysis beyond the emotional response to them, because the episode was in some ways technically accomplished even as it was experienced as a betrayal. The 45 minutes of saviors blocking every road is genuinely effective as a sustained pressure exercise. The sense of Rick's world closing in, each attempt to escape met by a larger, better organised response, communicates something real about the nature of what the saviors represent. This is not a ragtag group of violent survivors. This is an organisation that has been operating at scale for long enough to be able to coordinate across a wide geographic area with obvious competence. The episode is doing real narrative work in that first 45 minutes. The problem is what it does with the work it has done. The choice to end on a point-of-view shot was discussed by the creative team in subsequent interviews as being about preserving the impact of the death for the premiere. The argument being that knowing who Negan killed before the summer break would reduce the stakes of the premiere rather than heighten them. This is a defensible creative logic. It is also, in retrospect, the creative logic of a show that had learned to treat its audience's emotional anticipation as a resource to be harvested rather than a trust to be honoured. The reaction to the cliffhanger in the immediate aftermath is worth contextualising against the broader television landscape of 2016. This was a period in which streaming services had already begun changing the relationship between audiences and serialised drama. Binge watching an entire season or series in one or a few sittings had become a mainstream viewing behaviour, and with it had come a different relationship to cliffhangers. A cliffhanger between episodes in a streaming context is a pause of seconds before the next episode begins. A cliffhanger between seasons of a broadcast series is a 6-month wait. In 2016, those two experiences coexisted, and a significant portion of The Walking Dead's audience was also watching streaming content that resolved every narrative tension immediately. Against that backdrop, asking an audience to wait 6 months to find out who had been beaten to death by a baseball bat read differently than it would have read in 2005 or even in 2010 when the show began. The Walking Dead was competing for emotional engagement with entertainment products that had essentially eliminated the concept of waiting, and it chose the very moment of its most anticipated reveal to ask for the longest wait of its history. Gimple's statement that the wait would be worth it was reported widely. Its transformation into a piece of Walking Dead lore, something fans quoted back at the show, ironically, after the Season 7 premiere, illustrates what happens when a creative team's confidence in their own work is not matched by the audience's experience of it. One detail about the Negan cliffhanger that is sometimes mentioned but rarely examined carefully. The creative team reportedly had not definitively decided who Negan would kill at the time the episode was filmed. The point-of-view shot was not just an artistic choice about the audience's experience. It may also have been a practical choice that preserved the production's flexibility. Multiple actors filming the same scene from a victim's perspective allows the editing room to choose between them after the fact, based on audience response, network feedback, or other factors. If this account is accurate, it adds a dimension to the cliffhanger controversy that goes beyond manipulation of the audience, toward a decision that was already made. It suggests the show was, at least in part, still making the decision itself. That is a different kind of problem from a narrative standpoint, because it means the season was built toward a conclusion that had not been reached. The emotional investment the audience was asked to make in the severity and significance of whoever Negan would kill was being asked for before the creative team had settled on whom that person would be. Glenn Rhee first appeared on The Walking Dead in the second episode. He showed up on Rick Grimes' radio while Rick was trapped in a tank, surrounded by walkers with no obvious way out. His first line was more or less, "Hey you, dumbass. Yeah, you in the tank. Cozy in there?" He got Rick out of the tank. He helped him get out of Atlanta. He never really stopped helping people after that. 7 years later, on October 23rd, 2016, he died in the season 7 premiere, The Day Will Come When You Won't Be. 17 million people watched it, the show's second highest viewership ever, driven entirely by the need to know who Negan had killed at the end of the season 6 cliffhanger. The episode begins with Rick already broken, we see the aftermath before we see the event, and then loops back to show us what happened. The show makes you wait, again, before the reveals. Abraham was killed first, Negan's bat landing on Michael Cudlitz's character, in what, for readers of the comics, was the expected outcome, rerouted through a different victim. That lands as a genuine gut punch. Abraham's death is brutal, and the show does not soften it. Then Daryl punches Negan, and then Negan kills Glenn. What follows is what became the episode's defining controversy. Glenn's death in Robert Kirkman's comic, issue 100, one of the most discussed moments in the comic's run, is already a devastating piece of sequential art. The television version was more graphic than the comic, extended further, and included elements that the comic had not. Negan's mockery of Glenn's half-conscious final words, a fantasy sequence of Glenn at a peaceful family dinner, shown as a kind of hallucination, holding a baby he will never meet, a walker approaching the blood pooling on the ground. Critics who had been broadly supportive of the show through the dumpster controversy and the cliffhanger backlash largely came down against this episode. Matt Zoller Seitz at Vulture wrote that the violence had been nearly eroticized, that the camera's relationship to the gore was not horror in the service of story, but something more like spectacle in the service of sensation. David Sims at The Atlantic argued that the show was simply punishing its audience at this point, that there was no reading of the episode that justified it on narrative grounds. Andrew Lincoln, who played Rick, said in an Empire magazine interview that the episode might have been when we over-egged the omelette. That is a careful sentence from someone who was still employed by the show at the time, but it is also fairly unambiguous. The lead actor of The Walking Dead publicly acknowledged that the depiction of Glenn's death may have exceeded what was necessary or appropriate. A separate and somewhat underreported dimension of the criticism concerned the specific visual of Glenn's death and its resemblance to the real-world murder of Vincent Chin, a Chinese-American man who was beaten to death with a baseball bat in Detroit in 1982, a murder that became a landmark moment in the history of American civil rights activism for the Asian American community. This comparison was made primarily by Asian American critics and commentators, and it brought a context to the discussion that the show's creative team was not prepared to engage with. Glenn was one of the most prominent Asian American characters in the history of American television drama. The manner of his death and the extended graphic detail with which it was depicted was not experienced by all viewers the same way. Gimple defended the premiere in multiple interviews. His consistent position was that the graphic nature was narratively necessary, that the audience needed to understand Negan as a genuine threat, not a TV villain who could be defeated by the end of the season. He argued that the emotional devastation of Glenn's death was what set up everything that followed. This is not an entirely unreasonable argument, but it does not address the question of degree, of whether the specific execution required the specific level of extended graphic detail it employed. The show had killed beloved characters before in ways that were devastating without being this prolonged. The choice to go as far as this episode went was a choice, and it was one that a significant portion of the audience experienced as the moment they stopped trusting the show to handle the things it cared about with appropriate care. I keep coming back to Andrew Lincoln's "over-egged the omelette" line. That is the most honest public acknowledgement this moment received from inside the production. It is careful, clearly, but it is not nothing. When the lead actor of a show publicly suggests that his own show may have gone too far with a particular scene, that is a data point worth taking seriously. The ratings decline that followed, from 17 million at the premiere to 11 million at the season finale, was steeper than anything the show had previously experienced. It never recovered. The Vincent Chin comparison, which emerged in Asian American critical commentary fairly quickly after the season 7 premiere aired, is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is the dimension of the episode's controversy that received the least sustained attention in mainstream coverage. Vincent Chin was a Chinese-American man who was beaten to death in Detroit in June 1982, 2 days before his wedding. He was killed by 2 white auto workers who blamed Japanese car manufacturers for the decline of the American auto industry, an act of racially motivated violence that became a landmark case in Asian American civil rights history, because neither of his killers served a single day in prison after their manslaughter convictions resulted only in fines and probation. The weapon used was a baseball bat. The visual resonance between that killing and Glenn's death, a Chinese-American man beaten to death with a baseball bat, the camera remaining on the graphic detail of the beating, was not interpreted as a deliberate creative decision by the Walking Dead team. There is no credible argument that the season 7 premiere was intended as a reference to Vincent Chin, but the argument made by Asian American critics was not about intent. It was about effect, about what it means to graphically and extensively depict the killing of one of television's most prominent Asian American characters in a manner that visually echoes the most historically significant act of anti-Asian violence in recent American history. The Walking Dead's creative team did not engage substantively with this criticism in public statements. The conversation existed largely within Asian American media and critical communities, and did not become the central focus of the mainstream controversy around the episode, which remained primarily on the questions of gratuitous violence and audience manipulation. There is something worth noting in the asymmetry between the attention the 2 critiques received. The argument that the episode was too violent attracted widespread coverage and became the dominant narrative around the season 7 premiere's backlash. The argument that the violence had a specific racial context, and that the victim's identity gave that context particular significance, was a more pointed observation that required more specific cultural knowledge to engage with, and received correspondingly less mainstream coverage. Andrew Lincoln's "over-egged the omelette" statement remains the most candid public acknowledgement from within the production that something about the episode exceeded what was necessary. The statement is careful, might have been, is doing a lot of work, but it is also genuine in a way that distinguishes it from the defensive statements Gimple made in the same period. July 12th, 2017. The Walking Dead was in production on its 8th season in Senoia, Georgia. It was a Wednesday. John Bernicker was 33 years old and had worked as a stunt performer across more than 100 film and television productions. He was by every available account a professional with genuine experience, not a newcomer, not someone unfamiliar with the hazards of the work. He had been hired to perform a stunt in which his character would be thrown from a balcony by the character Dwight, played by Austin Emilio. The fall was supposed to land on padding below the balcony. Bernicker did not get far enough away from the balcony. He missed the padded landing zone. He fell approximately 20 to 22 feet onto a concrete floor. It took around 30 minutes for emergency transport to reach him. He was placed on life support and died that evening. The Season 8 premiere, Mercy, is dedicated to his memory. Filming was paused for nearly a week. The San Diego Comic-Con press events for the show that summer were cancelled. The Coweta County Sheriff's Department investigated and ruled the death an accident. The U.S. Department of Labor's Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, launched its own investigation into the working conditions on the production. In January 2018, OSHA issued its finding. Stalwart Films LLC, the production company responsible for the episode, was fined $12,675, the maximum fine allowable under federal law at the time, for failure to provide adequate protection from fall hazards. OSHA's citation included a list of measures it determined should have been implemented, reducing stunt fall distances to the minimum necessary using a free-fall catching system, providing adequate spotters with crash pads, and employing an independent safety specialist to assess the hazards before the stunt was performed. Bernecker's mother, Susan Bernecker, issued a statement after the OSHA finding and subsequently filed a civil lawsuit naming AMC, Stalwart Films, Robert Kirkman, Austin Amelio, and other parties. The lawsuit's argument went beyond the specific conditions of the stunt itself. It alleged that AMC had established a pattern of production pressure, prioritizing low costs and high profit margins, that made adequate safety measures financially impractical across multiple seasons of the show. The filing includes a line worth quoting directly. The production of Season 8 of The Walking Dead, like seasons before it, had an emphasis on keeping production budgets low and profits high. AMC disputed the characterization. The company stated that the production met or exceeded industry safety standards and that Bernecker had visited the filming location before the shoot, had discussed the stunt choreography with the stunt coordinator, had agreed the safety measures in place were sufficient, and had not expressed any concerns on the day of the accident. The lawsuit was eventually tried in a Georgia civil court. The specific outcome of the trial, and the settlement details, if any, were not disclosed publicly in a way that has become part of the documented record. There is something genuinely uncomfortable about sitting with the OSHA fine number, $12,675. That is the maximum penalty that federal law allowed for a fatal workplace accident in 2018. It is approximately the cost of 2 decent used cars. The Walking Dead's production budget for a single episode in this period was in the range of $3 to $4 million. I am not suggesting those numbers should be directly compared, but they do sit next to each other in an interesting way. The financial pressure that had shaped The Walking Dead since its first season, the same pressure Frank Darabont had described as causing him boiling rage, the same pressure that had constrained Season 2's storytelling, is what Bernecker's family alleged had shaped the specific safety decisions made on the day of his death. Whether that allegation is provable is a legal question, but it does connect the budget story that starts this video to the safety story that this section is about, and that connection is probably worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. The broader context of stunt safety in American film and television production is relevant to understanding the John Bernecker case, and it is something the industry has been grappling with for decades. Stunt performers occupy an unusual position in the labor structure of a production. They are often hired episode by episode or film by film without the long-term contracts that protect principal cast members, and their work involves the kinds of physical risks that most other film professionals do not face. The safety standards that govern stunt work are set by OSHA and by the industry's own protocols, but the enforcement of those standards is ultimately the responsibility of individual productions. The tension between production budgets and safety standards is not unique to The Walking Dead, but The Walking Dead case is notable because the lawsuit specifically named the budget pressure as a causal factor, not as background context, but as a direct contributor to the specific conditions under which Bernecker was working. The OSHA citation's recommendation that future stunt falls should employ an independent safety specialist is significant because it implies that the absence of an independent specialist was a contributing factor to what went wrong. An independent specialist, someone not employed by the production, not subject to the same budget pressures, not incentivized to approve a stunt in order to keep shooting on schedule, would have been positioned to raise concerns that people inside the production might have been reluctant to raise. The Season 8 premiere, Mercy, dedicated to Bernica's memory, aired on October 22nd, 2017, approximately 3 months after his death. The dedication appears at the end of the episode as a simple title card. Norman Reedus, who plays Daryl Dixon and who was among those who appeared at the San Diego Comic-Con events that were cancelled following Bernica's death, spoke publicly about how the tragedy had affected the cast. That maximum fine figure has been the subject of ongoing legislative discussion in the years since the Bernica case. The fine cap, which was set at levels that many Labour advocates argue are insufficiently deterrent for large productions, does not scale to the revenue or profitability of the production where the violation occurs. The same dollar amount represents a meaningfully different proportion of the annual budget of a small independent production than it does of a show generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. This is a systemic issue that extends well beyond The Walking Dead, but The Walking Dead case gave it specific public illustration during a period when it was attracting legislative attention. Whether that attention has produced meaningful reform in the years since is a question with a complicated answer. In Robert Kirkman's graphic novel series, Carl Grimes does not die. He is arguably the most important character in the comic, more important in some respects than his father. Carl's journey from a frightened child in the first issue to a young leader grappling with what kind of person the apocalypse has made him runs through the entire series. He is the show's thesis statement made human. This is what growing up looks like when the world has ended, and this is what the people who survived it are trying to give the next generation. In the television series, Carl Grimes was killed by a walker-bite. The death was revealed in the Season 8 mid-season finale in late 2017. Chandler Riggs had been playing Carl since he was 10 years old. He'd grown up on the set of The Walking Dead in a very literal sense. The show's Georgia filming locations had been his professional home for most of his adolescent life. By the time the decision was made to kill Carl, he was 17. By his own account, and by the account of his family, he received very little warning. Riggs had, in the period before his firing, bought a house in Senoia, Georgia, the town that served as the primary filming location for the show. He had built his life around the reasonable expectation that Carl Grimes was a long-term character. In the comics, Carl outlives his father. There was every reason to believe the television Carl would have years of storyline ahead of him. His father, William Riggs, published a post on Facebook in the wake of the news that became widely circulated before he deleted it. The substance of it was that Chandler had been absolutely devastated, that William himself was disappointed Scott had been dishonest with a 17-year-old making life decisions, and that the timing and manner of the notification had been unfair. Gimple's creative justification for Carl's death was, in the context of where the show was narratively, not entirely without logic. Carl's death in the mid-season finale was framed as the event that changes Rick's understanding of what he is fighting for, that instead of building a future for his son, Rick must now build the future his son believed in, because Carl died believing it was possible. The death was intended to reorient Rick's arc for the remaining war with Negan. The fan reaction did not accept this framing warmly, and the reason it did not is related to something the show had been doing for a while by this point, using character deaths as plot levers without demonstrating sufficient respect for what those characters represented. Carl was not just a character, he was the show's reason for existing in the most literal sense. The first season is, at its core, a story about a father finding his son, Every subsequent season operates in some relationship to the bond between Rick and Carl, the argument about what kind of people they are becoming, about whether the world they're building is worth the cost of building it. Removing Carl from that equation did not just lose a character, it removed the axis around which the show's moral geometry had been organised. There is something I find genuinely odd about this decision, even now. Not the decision to kill Carl in itself. The show killed major characters, that was established, but the decision to kill the character who, in the source material, was the whole point. It is a bit like if a show about a father and son decided, in its 8th season, that the son was the less interesting half of that dynamic. You can make that argument, maybe, but you have to know that you are fundamentally changing what the show is. The criticism came from fans, from critics, and from the comic's own readership, who had always understood Carl as the story's ultimate custodian. Kirkman, who maintained an executive producer credit on the show, did not publicly address the decision in a way that offered any meaningful clarity. The show lost something with Carl's death that it could not replace, and the ratings in the seasons following reflect an audience that had registered this in some meaningful way. The creative justification for Carl's death that Gimple advanced publicly was more developed than the brief summary suggests, and it is worth engaging with more fully because the argument is not without logic, even if the conclusion it leads to is contested. Gimple's position, as articulated in various interviews, was that Carl's death was the only thing that could change Rick's relationship to the ongoing conflict with the Saviors in a way that was both psychologically credible and narratively significant. Rick had been fighting Negan with the specific goal of building a future worth surviving into, a future for Carl. Carl's death eliminated the person that future was being built for, but Carl's dying words, his plea that Rick find a way to coexist with the survivors of the Savior conflict rather than exterminate them, gave Rick a reason to keep going. The argument was that Carl transferred his vision to Rick in death in a way he could not have in life. This is a structurally coherent reading of what the story needed. The problem is that it is also the reading of someone who had forgotten what Carl represented beyond his relationship to his father. In the comics, Carl's arc in the years following Rick's peak is one of the medium's most interesting studies of what it means to grow up in an environment defined by violence. Carl in the comic becomes harder and more pragmatic than his father in some respects, and more idealistic in others. He carries weapons and makes ruthless decisions, and also maintains a kind of moral imagination about what the world could be that Rick, battered by decades of survival decisions, struggles to access. That tension between the child who grew up in the apocalypse and the adult who remembers the world before it is the comic's deepest subject in its later pages. The television? Carl never got to be that character because he was killed at 16, before the version of Carl that Kirkman was writing had time to develop on screen. What The Walking Dead lost with Carl's death is not just an individual character, it is a specific kind of story. The story of what the apocalypse makes of someone who has never known anything else, that the show had been building toward for 8 years and then chose not to tell. Chandler Riggs has been gracious in interviews about the ending of his time on the show, declining in most public contexts to relitigate the specific decisions that were made. He returned to the show briefly in its final season for the dream sequence in Rick's exit episode, which suggests a relationship with the production that did not end in complete acrimony despite the circumstances. His father's Facebook post, deleted but widely preserved in screenshots, remains the most immediate emotional record of what those circumstances felt like to the family involved. The Chandler Riggs situation has a dimension that is easy to overlook in the focus on the firing itself. Riggs was a teenager who had spent most of his childhood in a professional environment that is genuinely unusual, a major television production where he was a central cast member and where the people around him were adults navigating complex industry dynamics. That environment shapes people in ways that are not always visible, and the specific manner in which his time on the show ended, the lack of advance notice, the house purchase, his father's public response, carries a particular weight when you consider that it involved a 17-year-old making real-world decisions based on professional assurances that turned out not to be reliable. Riggs has been, in subsequent interviews, gracious about the show and about his experience overall. He has spoken positively about his time playing Carl and has indicated that the experience, difficult ending and all, was formative in ways he values. This is a mature response from someone who had legitimate cause for grievance. It also does not change what happened or what it revealed about how the production communicated with its younger cast members. This is probably the section of this video that requires the most care to discuss accurately, because the criticism is specific and the response to it was largely inadequate, and both of those things deserve to be said. The pattern became visible most clearly around seasons 4 and 5. In a relatively compressed period of the show, the following characters died: T-Dog, Oscar, Bob Stuckey, Tyrese, and Noah. All 5 were black men. All 5 died within a span of storyline that felt, to a significant number of viewers, uncomfortably close together. And I think what made the response inadequate, and it was inadequate, which is worth just saying plainly, is that it engaged the criticism on the wrong terms. It treated a qualitative argument as a quantitative one, and that misreading tells you something about where the production's attention was and wasn't. The observation that followed, articulated in fan communities and eventually in mainstream critical writing, was not simply that the show had killed black characters. The Walking Dead killed everyone. That was established from the pilot. The observation was more specific, that the show appeared to operate on a principle of racial exclusivity, in which the number of significant black male characters in the main cast at any given time was effectively limited to 1, and that when a new black character was introduced, an existing one tended to die not long after. This is sometimes called the one-at-a-time pattern in discussions of race and representation in television, and it is not unique to The Walking Dead. But the Walking Dead version of it was notable because the show was otherwise positioned as genuinely diverse and progressive in its casting choices. Executive producer Gail Ann Hurd addressed the criticism in the press. Her response, that the show had killed more white characters than black characters in total, is numerically accurate and also somewhat beside the point, which is a slightly uncomfortable thing to say about a statement made in good faith. The counter-argument to Hurd's numbers defense is straightforward. The show had significantly more white characters than black characters, making the raw count a misleading measure of proportionality. More importantly, the criticism was not primarily quantitative, it was qualitative, about which characters received extensive development, which deaths were treated with narrative weight, and which were expedited. The show's treatment of Tyrese, played by Chad Coleman, is worth noting specifically. Tyrese was a major character in Kirkman's comics, complex, important, the kind of figure whose death in the source material was one of the comic's most significant moments. In the television series, he was introduced late, developed at a fraction of the depth the comics gave him, and killed in Season 5's 4th episode. What happened and what's going on in a death that, whatever its individual merits as an episode, removed him before his potential as a character had been realised? Michonne is the obvious exception to this pattern, and she is a significant one. Danai Gurira's portrayal of Michonne became one of the show's most compelling and central performances, and the show gave her a complete character arc across its full run. The Ones Who Live, the 2024 limited series, is built around her, but critics who raised the racial pattern noted that one fully developed black female character and a rotating cast of underdeveloped black male characters are two separate things. The show never developed a coherent public response to this criticism. It did gradually improve its handling of these dynamics in the later seasons. The show's final seasons included more meaningfully developed black characters, but by then the conversation had moved on, and the earlier pattern was part of the documented record. The critical conversation about race and The Walking Dead evolved considerably between its emergence in the early to mid-2000s and the show's final seasons. In the earlier period, the criticism was primarily about the pattern of deaths, the cycling of black characters in and out of the main cast in ways that created an impression of structural exclusivity. In the later period, the conversation expanded to include questions about which characters' deaths were treated with narrative weight and which were expedited, and about the relative depth of character development available to black cast members. Chad Coleman's Tyrese is probably the richest case study for this dimension of the discussion. In Kirkman's comic, Tyrese is introduced early and becomes one of the central characters of the story's first several hundred issues. His death in the comic, in issue 46, during the governor's assault on the prison, is one of the most devastating losses in the comic's run, specifically because the character had been developed so thoroughly that his absence from the story is felt for years afterward. The television, Tyrese was introduced in Season 3, approximately 2 full seasons after his comic introduction, and was killed in Season 5's 4th episode, What Happened and What's Going On. The episode is, taken on its own terms, genuinely good, a visually inventive and emotionally affecting episode that takes Tyrese's death seriously and gives it time. But it also kills a character who had been in the television show for 2 seasons after a comic character had existed and developed for years, and that gap in investment is perceptible. The show's defenders are correct that The Walking Dead killed white characters in large numbers: Shane, Laurie, Herschel, Andrea, Beth, and many more, and that no single demographic was safe in the Walking Dead universe. This is true, and it matters. But it does not resolve the specific observation about relative depth of development and relative speed to death for black male characters that the criticism was identifying. By the show's final seasons, the balance had shifted. Melissa McBride's Carol, a white woman, had become one of the show's most fully developed long-term characters. But the show had also meaningfully expanded the depth it gave to black characters in its later years. Kari Payton's Ezekiel, Danai Gurira's Michonne, and others were given the kind of extended development that earlier black characters had not received. Whether this represents genuine reckoning with the criticism or simply the natural evolution of a long-running ensemble cast is something that reasonable people interpret differently. What is clear is that the criticism, when it was raised, was not wrong. Bury your gaze is a term from media criticism that describes a specific pattern in television and film. LGBTQ characters are killed, often soon after their identity is established, at rates that are statistically disproportionate compared to their straight counterparts. The term has been in use in academic and fan criticism for decades, and it names something real, a tendency in mainstream entertainment to include queer representation without sustaining it, to give the appearance of diversity while treating it as expendable. The Walking Dead was cited as one of the more prominent examples of this pattern during the late 2000s and 10s, and having spent some time looking at the specific timing, Denise in Season 6, then Tara and Jesus within 4 episodes of each other in Season 9, it is difficult to argue the citation was unfair. Denise Cloyd, introduced in Season 5 and developed as a character with a lesbian relationship across Season 6, was killed in Season 6's 14th episode, twice as far by an arrow through the eye. Her death was, in the comics, the death of a different character, Abraham, who had already been killed in the television version by this point. The narrative decision to transfer Abraham's comic death to Denise meant that a queer female character was killed in a way that was not originally her death, for plot reasons that had nothing to do with her character, in a manner that struck many viewers as abrupt and wasteful. Tara Chambler had been one of the show's few out characters across multiple seasons. She was killed in Season 9's third episode, Warning Signs. Geyser's Paul Rovia, played by Tom Payne, whose sexuality was confirmed on screen in Season 8, was also killed in Season 9's 8th episode, Evolution. Two out characters, same season, killed 4 episodes apart. The clustering is what generated the most pointed response. Individual deaths can be explained as story decisions. A pattern of deaths cannot be explained that way without acknowledging that the pattern is itself a decision. The show's defenders made the equal opportunity argument that The Walking Dead made, that the show kills everyone, that applying a different standard to LGBTQ character deaths than to straight character deaths is itself a form of differential treatment. This is a coherent argument, and it has some merit. It also does not really account for the timing, which is where I think the defender's position gets weak. Saying we kill everyone does not explain why the queer characters keep dying so quickly after their identities are confirmed. The response from critics was that in a show where many major characters survive for multiple seasons and develop complete arcs, the speed at which LGBTQ characters tended to die after their identities were established was specifically notable. The argument was not that queer characters should be immune from death. It was that the particular combination of late introduction, limited development, and early death created a pattern that communicated something about whose stories the show considered worth telling at full length. The Walking Dead was not the only show to receive this criticism during this period. It was part of a broader conversation about LGBTQ representation on television that generated significant academic and journalistic attention around 2015 and 2016. But it was one of the most cited examples, and the Denise death in particular was pointed to repeatedly as a case where the decision had been clearly avoidable. What is worth noting, and this does not resolve the earlier criticism, but it is part of the full picture, is that the show did make some effort to address this in its later seasons. Aaron, one of the show's most consistently present LGBTQ characters, survived through to the finale. His partner Eric died in Season 8, but Aaron himself had a complete multi-season arc that did not end in the same abrupt manner as Denise or Tara. It is not a comprehensive reversal, but it is also not nothing. The more fundamental issue, which the show never quite resolved, is that the bury your gays criticism is not primarily about any individual death. It is about a casting and storytelling philosophy that treats LGBTQ characters as supporting colour rather than central investment, characters who add diversity to a scene without requiring the full narrative commitment that the show extended to its straight leads. Changing individual outcomes does not change that underlying philosophy. It just makes the pattern less obvious. And audiences who had been watching carefully enough to notice the pattern in the first place were also watching carefully enough to notice when the changes were structural versus cosmetic. The specific case of Denise Cloyd's death in Season 6 merits some additional attention because of what it illustrates about the relationship between the show's adaptive choices and its representational outcomes. In the comics, the death Denise received, an arrow through the eye from a savior sniper, in the middle of a speech, is the death of Abraham Ford. Abraham, in the television adaptation, was already established as a major character who would eventually have his own arc with Negan. The decision to give Abraham's comic death to Denise and then later kill Abraham in the Season 7 premiere meant that 2 significant character deaths were staged in close proximity, and that one of them, Denise's, killed off a queer female character in a manner that was not her death in the source material. This is not a case of the show going out of its way to kill a queer character for shock value. It is a case of an adaptive decision, rearranging which characters receive which deaths from the comics, having representational consequences that were not foregrounded in the decision-making. Denise's queerness was not why she was chosen to receive Abraham's death, but because she was chosen a queer female character, was killed in a way that matched the bury your gaze pattern, even if that pattern was not the motivation. The distinction matters, but critics argued that it matters less than it might seem to. The outcome, a queer character killed off abruptly in a dramatic and violent manner, without the development her character had been promised, is the outcome regardless of the internal logic that produced it. The audience experience of representation is shaped by outcomes, not by the production reasoning behind those outcomes. Jesus, played by Tom Paine, is another instructive case. His sexuality was confirmed on screen in Season 8 through a brief scene with Aaron, a scene that was celebrated in press coverage as a moment of positive representation. He was killed 4 episodes into Season 9. The gap between the confirmation of his identity and his death is measured in a single season. His death scene, attacked by walkers in a cemetery at night, is abrupt, and by the show's own standards, underdeveloped. The argument that The Walking Dead kills everyone does not explain why the characters, whose identities were most recently confirmed, tend to die so quickly after that confirmation. If representation were being treated as a long-term investment rather than a short-term signal, the timing would look different. Every show that runs for long enough eventually has to deal with the departure of its central character. Some shows handle this by ending. The character's story is the show's story, and when one concludes, so does the other. Some shows absorb the departure and reinvent themselves around new characters. The Walking Dead tried to do something more complicated than either of those options, and the result was a controversy that is, in some ways, the most philosophically interesting one on this list. Andrew Lincoln played Rick Grimes from the pilot in 2010 through Season 9 in 2018, 8 full seasons, with a 9th season partial. He announced his departure at San Diego Comic-Con in July 2018, which gave the audience months to prepare for whatever ending Rick's story would receive. The episode itself, Season 9, Episode 5, What Comes After, which aired on November 4th, 2018, was constructed as a kind of farewell. Rick is mortally wounded on a bridge, impaled on rebar, leading a massive walker herd away from his people. The episode moves through sequences that feel like memory and hallucination. Shane, Herschel, Sasha appearing to Rick in his fading consciousness. It is elegiac in its pacing. It has the texture of a finale. Rick, still alive, detonates a cache of explosives on the bridge. The bridge collapses. The walker herd is destroyed. Rick appears to go with it, and then he is found alive, downstream, by Jadis, a character who'd been introduced as the leader of a junkyard community and had been quietly operating as a liaison to a mysterious organization. She radios for pickup. A helicopter arrives. Rick Grimes is lifted away, alive, destination unknown. The episode had not finished airing when AMC announced that Rick Grimes would return in a series of Walking Dead feature films, which would continue his story. This is the specific detail that generated controversy. Previous Walking Dead fake-outs, Glenn under the dumpster, Carl's apparent death before the barn scene, had operated as narrative surprises within the show's own story. They were manipulative in various ways, but they were at least contained within the fiction. Rick's death was revealed to not be a death before the audience had finished processing the episode in a commercial announcement from the network. What the audience experienced was not the conclusion of Rick Grimes' story, but the transition of Rick Grimes' story to a different product. The helicopter was not a narrative choice, it was logistics for a franchise expansion. That distinction matters, because it changes what the show was asking its audience to feel in those final moments. The grief over Rick's departure, which was real and had been building for months, was recontextualized immediately as marketing content. The Rick Grimes films were eventually retooled and produced as a limited series titled The Ones Who Live, which aired on AMC in 2024. It is, by critical consensus, quite good. Andrew Lincoln and Danai Gurira deliver performances that are among the best work either has done in the franchise. Whether the quality of the eventual product vindicates the commercial decision made in 2018 is a question that depends on how you weigh artistic outcomes against the process by which they are achieved. For what it is worth, I think The Ones Who Live mostly does vindicate it. It tells a genuinely moving story, and it gives both characters an ending that the flagship show could not have delivered. But I also think the audience members who experienced the helicopter as a betrayal were not wrong to feel that way, and both of those things can be true simultaneously. The ending was good. The method of getting there was a bit cold. Lincoln has said in interviews that the decision to leave was personal. His family was in England. The demands of filming in Georgia were incompatible with the life he wanted, and that the film, and eventually series route, was genuinely the best available option for honouring Rick's story while allowing him to step away from the relentless schedule of the flagship show. That is probably true. It is also true that the audience, having been primed by years of the show, using their emotional engagement as a commercial instrument, experienced the helicopter moment not as the show finding a creative solution to a difficult problem, but as the show doing the thing it had been doing since the dumpster, using a death, or the appearance of a death, to manage attention rather than tell a story. The commercial context of Rick's departure requires a bit more unpacking than the immediate fan response captured. AMC was, by 2018, operating in a significantly different environment than it had been in 2010. Streaming services had fundamentally changed the economics of content, and the days when a cable network's most watched scripted show could command 17 million live viewers were already over as a sustainable expectation. The Walking Dead's audience had been declining since 2016, and AMC was facing the challenge that all traditional cable networks were facing: how to maintain the cultural relevance and commercial viability of a franchise whose flagship show was contracting. The film plan, later the limited series plan, was AMC's answer to that challenge for the Rick Grimes character specifically. By removing Rick from the flagship show while maintaining him in a separate product, AMC could claim both the emotional weight of his departure from the main series and the commercial value of his continued presence in the franchise. The helicopter was the mechanism for threading that needle. What AMC probably did not fully anticipate was how clearly the commercial reasoning behind the helicopter would be read by an audience that had, by this point, become quite good at identifying when the show was doing something for story reasons versus when it was doing something for franchise reasons. The Season 7 premiere backlash had taught many viewers to ask both questions simultaneously. What does this mean for the story, and why is this actually happening? Rick's helicopter exit arrived to an audience that had already developed that habit, and the film announcement before the credits finished rolling answered the second question before most people had even processed the first. The answer to the first question was visible and immediate. AMC announced the films before the episode ended. That simultaneity, the commercial announcement arriving while the emotional experience of the episode was still active, collapsed the distance between the story and its monetization in a way that felt qualitatively different from previous Walking Dead commercial decisions. The dumpster had been a creative decision with commercial implications. The helicopter was, in the audience's perception, a commercial decision with a creative wrapper. Lincoln's personal motivation, wanting to be with his family in England, is genuine and understandable. He has spoken about it consistently in the years since, and nothing in the record suggests it was a calculation. But individual motivations and institutional decisions produce the same outcomes, and the outcome of the Rick Grimes departure was experienced by the audience as the franchise prioritizing its own continuity over the integrity of its central story. The Ones Who Live, which eventually resolved Rick and Michonne's story, received strongly positive reviews in 2024. suggesting that the quality of the eventual outcome vindicated at least part of the decision. Whether that vindication arrives in time to matter for the audience members who stopped watching the flagship show as a result is a question with a necessarily uncertain answer. The Darabont settlement is covered in its own section, but the lawsuit ecosystem around The Walking Dead did not begin and end with him. It expanded, and the expansion tells you something interesting about the financial structure that the show operated within. In 2017, a group of 5 producers filed a joint lawsuit against AMC. The 5 were Gail Ann Hurd, Robert Kirkman, Charles Eagley, David Alpert, and Glenn Mazzara, a list that includes some of the most significant creative contributors to the show's existence. Kirkman created the original comic series. Hurd has been an executive producer since the beginning. Mazzara ran the show through one of its most successful periods. Their combined creative contribution to The Walking Dead is not marginal. Their lawsuit made essentially the same argument Darabont had made, that AMC's vertical integration, its operation as both production studio and broadcasting network, allowed it to set the internal license fee at an artificially low level, depressing the profits that participants were contractually entitled to share. They argued they were collectively owed figures comparable to those at the heart of the Darabont case. The case proceeded through the courts for several years. After the Darabont settlement in 2021, the producers filed an additional lawsuit in November 2022, this one arguing that the settlement triggered a most favoured nation clause in their own contracts. The legal logic of this is worth understanding because it is genuinely interesting. A most favoured nation clause in a contract means that, if one party gets a better deal than you on equivalent terms, you're entitled to the same improvement. When AMC settled with Darabont and adjusted the profit calculation methodology as part of that settlement, the producers argued that this triggered their right to the same adjusted methodology. A judge agreed that the producers had alleged sufficient facts to make this argument worth hearing. AMC largely prevailed in subsequent rulings, however, and the case was decided in the network's favour by 2024. The combined picture across all of these lawsuits is striking. Frank Darabont, fired in 2011, sued and received a 9-figure settlement that effectively wiped out AMC's free cash flow for the year. Glenn Mazzara, the showrunner who replaced him, was part of the group that sued. Gail Ann Hurd, who maintained an executive producer credit for the entire run of the show, sued. Robert Kirkman, whose comic series the show was based on, and who promoted the show publicly for its entire run, was a plaintiff. Essentially every major creative contributor to The Walking Dead's formative years ended up in legal conflict with the network over money. The pattern is so consistent that it stops being a series of individual disputes and starts being a description of a system. What I find genuinely striking about this, looking at the full list, Darabont, Mazzara, Hurd, Kirkman, Eagley, Alpert, is that these are not disgruntled fringe figures. These are the people who made the show, the person who created the original comic, the person who spent 5 years getting it onto television, the 2 showrunners who built its audience, all of them eventually in court with the network that broadcast their work. That is not bad luck, that is policy. The system is vertical integration, and the argument these lawsuits were making, that a company should not be allowed to set the fee it charges itself, because doing so allows it to manipulate profit calculations for outside participants, became one of the more significant Hollywood legal conversations of the decade. The Walking Dead lawsuits did not resolve that conversation, but they contributed to it in ways that have had industry-wide implications. AMC, for what it is worth, has consistently maintained that it acted in accordance with its contractual obligations. The settlement with Darabont was framed in the SEC filing as a resolution, not an admission. The legal system produced its outcomes. The question of what those outcomes mean is one the industry is still working through. The vertical integration argument at the heart of the Walking Dead lawsuits is genuinely important to understand, because it is not just about this show. It is about a structural feature of the modern entertainment industry that has significant implications for anyone who creates content for a network-owned studio. The phrase Hollywood accounting has been around for decades and refers to a fairly specific thing: the way studios have historically structured their finances so that profitable productions appear, on paper, to generate minimal profit. It sounds like a conspiracy theory until you look at it, and then it is just a very unpleasant set of accounting practices that have been litigated extensively and complained about by essentially every creative professional who has ever had a profit participation deal. The Walking Dead case added a specific dimension to this long-standing argument: the vertical integration angle, where the same company sits on both sides of the financial equation, means the system is even harder to challenge from the outside than it would otherwise be. AMC Studios produced The Walking Dead. AMC Networks broadcast it. AMC Studios set the license fee that AMC Networks paid for the right to broadcast it. Because these were divisions of the same company, the license fee did not need to reflect what an arm's-length transaction between unrelated parties would have looked like. And because profits are calculated after the license fee is subtracted, a below-market license fee directly reduces what profit participants, people like Darabont, Kirkman, Hurd and Mazzara, are contractually owed. The Darabont contract specified that the license fee should be comparable to what AMC Studios would charge an unrelated third-party distributor for a comparable program. The lawsuit alleged that AMC had not honoured this provision, that the internal fee was set below what a genuine arm's-length fee would have been. This is a legal argument about contract interpretation and financial mechanics, and the courts produced a complex and nuanced resolution of it over nearly a decade. The settlement does not resolve the question of whether AMC violated its contractual obligations. Settlements typically include provisions specifically precluding that kind of admission. It does resolve the dispute financially. Whether the amount represents accountability or simply the cost of making the argument go away is something that can be read either way. What the Walking Dead litigation contributed to the broader industry conversation is a more specific articulation of what the vertical integration problem looks like in practice. Other productions have faced similar structures. The Walking Dead case produced the most detailed public record of how those structures operate in a specific high-profile context. That record has been cited in subsequent industry discussions about profit participation and vertical integration, making the Walking Dead lawsuits something more than just a story about this show's internal conflicts. The Walking Dead's commercial footprint extended well beyond its television revenue, and this scale is relevant to understanding why the profit participation disputes were so significant. The franchise generated substantial merchandise revenue: comic collections, action figures, clothing, video games, board games, and licensed products across multiple categories. Darabont's profit participation entitlement was structured in terms of the show's profits, but his lawsuit also included claims related to spin-offs and ancillary products derived from the franchise he had brought to television. The settlement's provision, buying him out of most of his rights to Walking Dead-related content, including spin-offs, was structurally significant because it resolved not just the original show's financial disputes, but Darabont's potential claims on a franchise that has continued generating revenue well past the flagship show's conclusion. The scope of what was being settled, in other words, went beyond the 11 seasons of the original show to encompass the ongoing commercial life of the universe it had created. March 2017, Season 7, Episode 12. The episode is called Say Yes, and it is centered on Rick and Michonne scavenging together, one of the season's quieter and more character-focused episodes. Rick spots a deer in a field. He climbs a Ferris wheel that has been left standing in an abandoned fairground to get a better vantage point. The Ferris wheel gives way, Rick falls, walkers close in, And there is the deer, standing in the field, rendered in computer-generated imagery that the internet almost immediately determined was not quite convincing. The screenshots circulated within hours. The comparisons were mostly to what digital effects looked like in productions with significantly larger budgets. Game of Thrones was the most frequently invoked example, which is slightly unfair because Game of Thrones had, at that point, an episode budget of roughly $10 million to The Walking Dead's 3 or 4. But fairness was not the primary mode of the conversation. What made the deer resonate beyond its individual moment was the context it arrived in. The Walking Dead in Season 7 was already operating under a significant goodwill deficit. The dumpster incident, the Negan cliffhanger, the Season 7 premiere's reception, these had created an audience that was watching with less patience and more readiness to find fault than it had brought to the show's peak years. A single, slightly unconvincing digital animal became the focus of a broader frustration that had been building for some time. There is also something genuinely interesting about what the deer represents from a production perspective. The show's visual effects budget, like every other budget line, had been squeezed by the financial dynamics that ran through The Walking Dead's entire production history. The CGI deer is not a mystery. It is what happens when a show with the marketing profile of a prestige drama is operating with the production resources of a mid-budget cable series. The gap between what the audience expected, based on the show's cultural position, and what the budget could actually deliver, had been visible in various ways since Season 2. The deer was just the version that went viral. I find it genuinely hard to be particularly harsh about this one. It is a deer. It is a single shot in a single episode. It looks like what it was that a visual effects decision made under budget constraints. And it became a symbol because the audience needed a symbol for something it had been feeling for longer than the deer had existed. The Season 7 deer is now, for a certain generation of Walking Dead viewers, the image that comes to mind when they try to articulate the moment the show stopped feeling like it was operating at a particular standard. That is a lot of cultural weight for a digital deer in a Georgia fairground to carry. There is a broader point here about the relationship between production values and audience trust that is worth lingering on for a moment. When a show is in good standing with its audience, when the goodwill account is healthy, visual effects limitations are forgiven, or even found charming. Early seasons of shows that went on to be beloved are full of visually unconvincing moments that nobody talks about because the emotional investment in the story overrides the technical shortfall. The audience is too busy caring about what is happening to notice the mechanics of how it looks. When the goodwill account is depleted, the dynamic reverses. The same technical shortfall that would have been overlooked becomes evidence. Evidence of a pattern. Evidence that the show has stopped trying, or stopped caring, or is operating below the standard its own cultural position implies. The deer is a relatively minor visual effects decision that became a cultural moment because it arrived at the precise point when a significant portion of the audience had stopped extending the benefit of the doubt. That is not really about the deer. The deer is just where the needle finally landed. And in a strange way, that is the most honest thing the deer moment reveals about where The Walking Dead was in its 7th season. The show's budget pressures had been present since 2010. The compromises they required had always been visible if you looked. What changed in 2017 was not the budget. What changed was that enough viewers had disengaged enough to start looking. The broader production values conversation, of which the CGI deer became a symbol, has a context that is worth articulating clearly. By 2017, the television landscape had shifted dramatically in terms of what audiences expected from major dramatic productions. Game of Thrones was producing dragon sequences that competed with feature film visual effects. Stranger Things had demonstrated that a modestly budgeted Netflix production could look visually distinctive and expensive without being expensive. The bar for what prestige television looks like had moved significantly in the years since The Walking Dead's debut. The Walking Dead's per-episode budget in Season 7 was somewhere in the range of $3 to $4 million per episode, a figure that had been contested and compressed since the budget arguments of 2010 and 2011. That is not a trivial budget. It is, however, significantly below what Game of Thrones was spending per episode in the same period. Estimates for that show's later seasons run to 8 to 10 million per episode or more. The visual effects budgets are not directly comparable because the shows are making different kinds of visual effects demands, but the gap matters when the audience is implicitly comparing the two. There is also a specific challenge that The Walking Dead faced with its visual effects budget that shows set in contained or fantastical worlds do not. The Walking Dead exists in a contemporary, recognizable American setting, the same woods, towns and highways that audiences see in real life. When a visual effect in this show does not look convincing, it is immediately noticeable precisely because the audience has a reference point for what it should look like. A slightly unconvincing dragon in a fantasy setting reads differently than a slightly unconvincing deer in a Georgia field because the audience has seen real Georgia fields but has no direct experience of realistic dragon movement. The deer screenshot became a minor cultural moment, partly because it was genuinely funny. The internet's capacity for immediate collective appreciation of an unexpected visual is well documented, and partly because it arrived at a moment when The Walking Dead's cultural stock had dropped enough that the production was no longer given the benefit of the doubt that audiences extend to shows they are fully invested in. A show that its audience trusts produces a questionable visual effect, and the audience notes it with mild amusement. A show that its audience is actively re-evaluating produces the same visual effect, and it becomes an image that circulates for years. The Walking Dead series finale aired on November 20th, 2022. The episode was called Rest in Peace, which is either the most appropriate title they could have chosen or the most ironic, depending on how you feel about the show's final years. Approximately 1.4 million people watched it live. The Walking Dead began its run with 5.35 million viewers for its Halloween 2010 premiere. It reached its highest point with the Season 5 premiere in October 2014 at 17.29 million, the most watched episode of any scripted cable drama in the history of American television. The series finale drew 1.4 million. That trajectory from 5 million to peak cable history to barely 1.5 million is the numerical record of everything that happened in between. The budget fights, the firings, the cliffhangers, the fake-outs, the lawsuits, the deaths, the departures. All of that is visible in the graph, if you look at it the right way. The finale itself received a mixed critical reception, which is perhaps the most accurately descriptive thing that can be said about it. The episode included a significant time jump. The show's conclusion showed a rebuilt and somewhat functional Commonwealth society under Ezekiel's leadership, with functional infrastructure, education, and social order beginning to reassert themselves. This ending divided the fan base in a way that was genuinely interesting, because the division was not primarily about execution, but about premise. There is a reading of The Walking Dead's entire 11-season run that says the show's deepest subject was always whether human civilization was worth rebuilding and whether the cost of survival was worth paying if what you were surviving toward was just a reproduction of what you had before. An ending that showed things working out, communities rebuilt, children in school, agriculture and commerce resuming, felt to some viewers like a betrayal of the show's most honest impulses. The darkness was the point. The ending negated the darkness. There is another reading that says the darkness was never the point, that it was always the texture, not the argument, and that the argument was always about hope, about whether love and community and the stubborn human determination to build things were stronger than entropy. And an ending that shows those things prevailing is not a betrayal of the darkness. It is what all the darkness was for. I find myself somewhere between those two positions, which is probably the honest answer for anyone who watched the whole thing. The finale felt earned in some places and rushed in others. There are moments in it that land, and there are moments where you can feel the writers trying to close threads that the show had left unresolved for too long. It is not a triumphant ending. It is a complicated one, which is probably the most appropriate ending a show this complicated could have received. What is less divisive is the question of legacy, how The Walking Dead ended up, and what it left behind. The spin-offs that followed the finale represent AMC's continued investment in the franchise. Dead City, which continues the Negan and Maggie story in a Walker-overrun Manhattan. Daryl Dixon, which moved the fan-favourite Norman Reedus character to France. The Ones Who Live, which finally resolved Rick and Michonne's story in the limited series format. There is also Fear the Walking Dead, which ran for 8 seasons and eventually concluded. The existence of that spin-off universe is The Walking Dead's most complicated legacy point. On one hand, it suggests that the world Kirkman and Darabont and the 4 showrunners and all the writers and all the actors built was rich enough to sustain ongoing exploration. Characters and stories continue. The universe did not die with the flagship. On the other hand, some critics argue that the spin-offs dilute the emotional specificity of the original show. That what made The Walking Dead meaningful was not the zombie apocalypse as a setting, but these specific characters in this specific community, and that moving the camera to New York or France, with partially or entirely different casts, creates something generically related but not the same thing. What can be said with confidence is that the Walking Dead franchise, for all its documented chaos, has demonstrated a durability that most of its critics did not expect. The show that Frank Darabont spent 5 years trying to get made, that was almost immediately subjected to budget cuts, and eventually lost its creator to a termination and a decade of litigation, that cycled through 4 showrunners and accumulated controversies at a rate that would have ended most comparable productions. That show ran for 11 seasons, produced 4 spin-offs, generated a universe that is still generating content, and settled the lawsuit that had run for nearly a decade. That is not the record of a show that failed. It is the record of something much more complicated than failure. The final season of The Walking Dead, Season 11, which was extended from its original run to 24 episodes, is itself a small controversy in its own right that tends to get lost in the broader legacy conversation. AMC made the decision to expand the final season, giving the show more episodes to conclude its story. This was presented publicly as an opportunity for the show to give its characters and storylines the ending they deserved. It was also, transparently, an opportunity to generate more revenue from the franchise before its conclusion. Whether those two motivations are compatible is a question the season itself provides somewhat mixed evidence for. The extended episode count gave the show time to develop the Commonwealth storyline, a significant comic arc involving a large functioning community with its own political dynamics, more fully than a shorter season would have allowed. It also required the show to pad certain narrative stretches in ways that critics noticed, and that, in a final season, carry particular cost. An audience that has committed to a show through 11 seasons and is watching its conclusion has limited patience for episodes that feel like they are marking time. The Commonwealth arc is, it should be noted, one of the show's genuinely interesting political ideas. The notion that the most dangerous thing the survivors might encounter is not a brutal dictator, but a recognizable society with familiar institutions and familiar corruptions. The argument the arc makes about the inevitability of certain kinds of political organization is more sophisticated than the show's reputation for blunt storytelling suggests. It did not fully land, partly because of pacing and partly because the show had trained its audience to expect physical threats rather than systemic ones. The viewers who watched Rest in Peace, a figure far below the show's peak, are sometimes described as though they represent the show's final state, the survivors of the long decline from 17 million. But the Walking Dead universe, as it existed in late 2022, was significantly more distributed than that number suggests. The spin-offs were drawing their own audiences. Dead City's first season, in 2023, received critical coverage that treated it as a genuine creative event, rather than a franchise obligation. The Ones Who Live in 2024 was, in several critical assessments, the best Walking Dead content since the show's peak years. The franchise model that AMC built using The Walking Dead as its foundation, one in which a concluding flagship generates a constellation of ongoing spin-offs, had precedent in cable television, but not at quite this scale. Whether it represents a sustainable way of telling ongoing stories in a shared universe, or whether it will eventually exhaust the audience's willingness to engage with variations on the same world, is a question that is still being answered in real time. Robert Kirkman ended The Walking Dead comic in 2019, issue 193, with a final issue that arrived without warning, as a surprise release that he described as the ending the story had always been heading toward. Rick Grimes dies in the comic in issue 192, shot by a community member who resents the order Rick has built. The community that remains in the final issue is moving forward. Life continues. Children are growing up. The dead no longer walk. The world is, imperfectly and tentatively, rebuilding. It is a quietly devastating ending, more honest about what survival costs and what it produces than almost anything the television adaptation managed in its final seasons. It is also, coming from the man who created all of this, the clearest statement of what he thought The Walking Dead was always about. Not the conflict, not the deaths, not the moral compromises and the villain arcs and the community sieges, the world after, the generation that grows up without knowing what the world was before. That is what Kirkman was always writing toward, and the comic found a way to arrive there that the television show, for all its scale and ambition and chaos, was not quite able to replicate. That's all of it, really. 15 controversies, 14 years, one extraordinary mess of a television program that became genuinely important and made genuinely bad decisions in roughly equal measure. A show with this many documented problems should not have lasted 11 seasons and spawned 4 spin-offs. By the logic of any straightforward analysis of how creative industries work, where quality is preserved, where trust is valued, where the people who make something share appropriately in its success, The Walking Dead should have hit a wall much earlier. The Frank Darabont situation alone should have changed how the show operated. It did not. And the reason it did not is probably the most interesting fact about The Walking Dead as a cultural and commercial object. The show was resilient enough to absorb enormous amounts of self-inflicted damage because what it was, at its best, connected with people in a way that could not be undone by behind-the-scenes dysfunction, or by bad creative decisions, or by the specific catastrophes this video has covered. People who stopped watching because of the Negan cliffhanger still remembered the barn. People who never forgave the dumpster still remembered the moment they first understood what Herschel Green was. The thing that strikes me, having gone through all of this, is how much of it was avoidable. Not the zombie apocalypse, that part was presumably deliberate, but the structural conflicts, the budget fights that started before Season 2 aired, the revolving door that meant 4 different people were asked to steer the same ship toward 4 different horizons, the financial arrangements that made litigation almost inevitable. Most of the damage the show did to itself was not the product of malice. It was the product of a system that was never quite designed to protect the thing it was building. And the show was worth protecting. Even people who stopped watching it remember the parts they watched with something that is not quite nostalgia and not quite grief. The farm, the prison, No sanctuary. Herschel on that fence post. Glenn from the very beginning all the way to the very end. Rick on that bridge, arms raised. That latitude the show had to absorb all of this and keep going was sometimes abused. The people who worked on it, especially those whose financial contributions were not adequately recognised, and John Bernecker, whose death was not adequately prevented, deserved better than they received. That can be true at the same time as the show being, at its peak, genuinely important television. It is a complicated thing. Most things that matter are. If you enjoyed this, do subscribe. It helps more than you might think. Take care of yourselves. Good night.